This crime was one of the most controversial and difficult for law enforcement officers in the state of Iowa. A murder occurred in self-defense. But the more investigators delved into the circumstances of what happened, the more convoluted the story seemed. A string of suspects paraded before detectives, but there wasn't a single serious lead. Years went by until doubts arose that this whole case was built on a lie. Today we will try to understand the circumstances of the events that completely turned Tracy Roberts' life upside down in 1900. The Roberts family moved from Chicago to the small town of Early, Iowa. The couple's names were Tracy and Michael. The young woman was American, and the man was a native of Australia. They lived as a young family and seemed like decent people to all members of the local community. It was the second marriage for both of them. Tracy had a son from a previous relationship. Michael was a real computer genius who ran an IT business from home. The man had many ideas that he planned to implement. Tracy was just cheerful and sociable. The woman was a housewife, played sports, and always looked great. The couple met on the internet, and they began a whirlwind romance. Just 18 days after meeting in person, they got married. Later, 2 children, a son and a daughter, were born into the marriage. It seemed that the family was very happy. Many people liked Michael's determination. For example, their neighbor, a realtor, with whom they had pulled off several profitable deals together. Her name was Mona, and she was ready to do anything to continue cooperating with Michael. It seemed mutual. Mona shared that her 20-year-old son, Dustin, was very withdrawn and couldn't find a job. He would get one job, then another, but he couldn't hold on to one for long. Then Michael offered to take the guy under his wing and see what he was capable of. It sounded like an interesting offer, so the realtor agreed. The man began to teach Dustin the intricacies of his business, took him on vacations, and to church. He supported the young man in every way. Overall, Michael was considered a kind, pleasant, and responsive person. His wife was also considered sweet and sociable. The couple was raising 3 children. Tracy took care of the house and children. While her husband worked, he was often away from home on business trips. Of course, no one thought that such a situation could happen to this family. It happened on the evening of December 13, 2001, in the town of Early. In one of the local houses, 35-year-old mother Tracy was preparing dinner with her children. Food was cooking in the kitchen, and on the second floor she was drawing water in the bath for her 1-year-old daughter. At that time, her 2 older sons, aged 3 and 11, were sitting in front of the TV. In the bedroom of the eldest son, Bert, suddenly, the boys heard their mother's blood-curdling scream. It was very alarming and frightening, so the eldest child, Bert, ran towards his mother's scream to see what had happened. He saw Tracy trying to enter his room through the doorway, but someone grabbed her by the hair and literally dragged her back into the hallway. The woman had her little daughter in her arms, whom she barely managed to pass to her son. When the struggle with the attacker began, Tracy slammed the door behind her, behind which rustling and a loud fight could be heard. Then, the boy heard female wheezing and again muffled cries for help. The son was very scared and didn't know what to do. Then there was a short period of silence, and after the gunshot, his mother survived. During this attack, she managed to fight off the criminals. One of them was killed, and the second fled. The 11-year-old boy called 911 around 7 p.m. He reported that strangers had entered his house and attacked his mother. Law enforcement officers realized it wasn't a joke and immediately drove to the specified address. At that moment, it was completely unclear what had happened to Tracy, as well as to her 3 children. More than 30 kilometers to the house with the victims flew by in a matter of minutes. Paramedics were met by the working children, as well as the frantic mother at the house. Tracy kept screaming that the criminal was upstairs and pointed them to the stairs. But according to protocol, the medics could not enter the house until the police inspected it and gave the all-clear that it was safe. They began to provide assistance to the woman. Then police officers arrived. They went up to the 2nd floor and found a young man lying in a pool of blood. He was dead. There was no one else inside. Tracy was conscious but severely out of breath, so the medics immediately put her in a car and took her to the nearest medical center. This all looked like an unexpected, brutal crime. But even more difficulties lay ahead. The whole family felt bewildered. There was a colossal number of questions that no one could answer. The police joined the investigation to solve this difficult puzzle. What happened stirred up the small town of Early, where it all took place. It was a very quiet, peaceful town where nothing like this had ever happened. There are only 500 local residents here, and everyone knows each other. The police interviewed the victim's eldest son. The 11-year-old boy said he saw someone attacking his mother, preventing her from entering the children's room and dragging her out by the hair back to the son, who initially froze in shock. There was nothing left to do but fight back if his mother couldn't handle it. To protect himself and the other children, he grabbed a baseball bat and prepared to attack the first person who entered his room. When the noise subsided, he could only hear his mother's heavy breathing and wheezing. After a while, the child heard the voices of two men outside. They started banging on the door. Then the frightened boy began to shout, using all the swear words he knew to scare the criminals. Behind the door, there was the sound of footsteps and men shouting about a gun. This was followed by more than a dozen gunshots, and then his mother opened the door. He almost hit her with the bat as he tried to fight back against whoever burst into the room. He was happy that it was finally over and called 911. Hearing about what happened, the family friend Mona rushed over. She was trying to find her 20-year-old son Dustin, who was friends with the family. His car was parked in the driveway, but by the time the woman arrived, the entire area, including her son's car, was cordoned off. She was not allowed inside the Roberts' house. The woman asked the law enforcement officers present where her son was. They replied that he was dead. The guy, whose mentor was the head of the family, was lying in a pool of blood near the second-floor bedroom. Tracy had shot him dead. This happened during the struggle. Because of the guy's attack, the police did not provide any information. They didn't let her say goodbye to her son, nor did they go into detail about what exactly happened there. The woman remained in complete ignorance. At this time, 20 kilometers from her home, Tracy finally regained consciousness. In the hospital, she was able to breathe normally. There were marks on the woman's neck that looked like strangulation. Evening, drawing a bath on the second floor when she heard a noise downstairs. The woman thought her husband had returned home early from a business trip and went out to look. But she saw two men. They started climbing the stairs as Tracy ran with the girl to her eldest son's room and handed the girl to him. She also tried to run into the room and close the door behind her, but she was grabbed by the hair and pulled into the hallway. After that, one of the attackers took her tights and began to strangle her. In the process, Tracy lost consciousness and the criminals were distracted. When she woke up, she heard Bert's screams from behind the door. She realized this was the perfect moment to act, so she got up and ran to the gun safe, which was located next to the bed in the master bedroom. The attackers caught up with her, but somehow the woman managed to enter the code and get the gun. Tracy pointed the barrel at them and pulled the trigger, but nothing happened because the weapon was on safety. However, the attackers were confused, and that was enough for the gun to fire on the next pull. She was instantly deafened by the bang. She continued to shoot towards the attackers until the whole room was filled with smoke. Tracy couldn't see the criminals, but she heard the footsteps of a person running out of the house. In the end, one criminal fell and the second fled. The woman also heard her frightened children calling her name and headed to her son's room. Opening it, she barely dodged her son's bat swinging at her head as he was trying to defend himself. But the main thing was that the children were okay. By this time, the smoke in the master bedroom had cleared, and Tracy saw the still-alive 20-year-old Dustin on the floor. According to her, the guy started to get up. At that moment, the woman picked up the gun again and ordered him to stay put, as she was in a state of shock and just wanted all this to stop. She shouted at him not to get up and not to move, but Dustin, who was the son of her friend Mona, didn't listen, started to get up and move towards her. Fearing for her safety and the safety of her children, she fired several more shots, after which Dustin fell again and was killed. There were no traces of the second criminal. Tracy said that Dustin had come to their house earlier that day and, learning that her husband was on a business trip, stood on the porch for a long time and didn't want to leave. He was acting very strangely, and Tracy literally had to close the door in his face. According to the victim's description, the second participant in the crime was tall, with dark hair, around 30 years old, but she didn't get a good look at his face. That evening, Tracy's husband Michael was on a business trip in Minneapolis. It was completely unclear why the guy he had taken under his wing would attack his wife and children with an accomplice. The second attacker was still at large, and he could very well return and take revenge. Therefore, Tracy was terrified. The woman was afraid to go into the house and be alone. She couldn't sleep peacefully. She was only worried about her family's safety. However, the second criminal could not be found for a long time. All the police had to go on was the vague description the victim provided. They began to study Dustin's social circle, trying to understand who he could have gone to the Roberts' house with. Many considered Tracy a true hero. After this, Tracy's story almost became a source of national pride. The woman gave several interviews to journalists in front of the cameras. She and her husband Michael held hands, and she spoke calmly. "I did what I had to do to protect my family." The entire audience applauded her, and many considered her actions a justified killing. Tracy was brave. She managed to protect not only herself, but also her children. She was compared to a mother bear. However, the police were not used to taking things at face value, so they began to analyze everything that happened, as they found this story not entirely convincing. And the more officers delved into the case materials, the more controversial the personality of the woman who killed the attacker became. Despite the widespread support Tracy received from the very beginning of this case, there were several people for whom what happened was a tragedy. The mother of the shot guy was going through the hardest moment of her life. All of this literally broke her heart. For her, all the circumstances of the murder that the victim described made no sense. The mother had nightmares about this attack in which her son died. At the same time, the mother of the shot guy, Mona, was giving interviews to the media. She was shocked by what had happened. Dustin wasn't evil. On the contrary, he was a kind guy. He never showed aggression towards other people, had no criminal past, and there was not a single prerequisite for him to attack the Roberts. However, Dustin had problems with social adaptation. He even went to a psychologist with his mother. It was hard for the guy to make friends at school. He was often bullied by peers and not invited to parties and celebrations. Mona went with him from doctor to doctor, but they all gave different diagnoses and didn't say anything specific. Could this have erupted into aggression simply because the teenager couldn't cope and snapped? Tracy admitted to the police that she was always afraid of Dustin. She felt not just uncomfortable around him, she felt scared, unsafe, even in the presence of her husband. She avoided meeting the young man in every way, and under no circumstances agreed to leave him with the children. The woman was sure he would hurt them. These accusations shocked Mona. She had no idea her friend was having such difficulties with her son. It seemed to her that everything looked quite the opposite. The police, having examined the crime scene, concluded that Dustin had no motive for the brutal attack, unless it was planned as a robbery. There were quite a few valuables in the Roberts' house, so Tracy suggested that the young criminals wanted to profit by stealing cash, or, for example, one of Michael's collectible weapons. Nevertheless, the criminals' actions did not look like an attempted robbery. They didn't even take the money and jewelry that were lying in plain sight, and didn't try to take the jewelry off Tracy when she lost consciousness from strangulation. They attacked her immediately, as if their goal was violence itself. At the same time, they did not try to rape her. Could the motive for the attack have been a sex crime? Or was it an old grudge? Or just an act of unmotivated aggression? All this was incomprehensible to the acquaintances and relatives of the shot guy. Despite his problems, he did not seem like someone capable of a violent crime. Quite quickly, the police found a probable solution to the motive for this attack. According to Tracy and her husband, she had recently been attacked, sometime before the home invasion. The woman was sexually assaulted in the dentist's office while under anesthesia. She woke up during the process. The doctor tried to persuade the woman to keep quiet and not tell anyone about this incident. In return, he promised to go to a medical center to deal with his sexual problems and also to pay the victim $150,000 in compensation. Tracy told her husband about this. He insisted on going to the police. Literally 2 days after the attempt to strangle the mother of 3, she was supposed to be in court against her dentist, whom she was going to accuse of rape. He was likely the second person who broke into her house and wanted to get rid of the victim of his harassment so she couldn't testify against him. However, as investigators found out, the dentist had no connection with Dustin and he had a solid alibi. He was at work. After that, the woman remembered another person who might well have wished her dead. He turned out to be a much more likely suspect in the crime than the dentist. This person was John Piaton, who was Tracy's first husband. They met at Northwestern University in Chicago, where they both studied medicine. John was a fourth-year student and interned at a Chicago clinical hospital, and 19-year-old Tracy was a first-year student studying radiology. He was very domineering and aggressive. But Tracy had spent her whole childhood with a domineering father, so she was used to this kind of treatment and considered it normal. Tracy married him. Later they moved to Denver, Colorado, and there she gave birth to a son. When her first husband tried to totally control everything that happened in her life, she considered it commonplace. However, over time, the marriage began to fall apart. Tracy said that he often tortured her, especially during intimacy. In the end, she got tired of enduring physical abuse. They separated 2 years later, after which the question of custody of their 3-year-old son Bert arose. However, the boy confessed to his mother that his father had molested him. As a result, a heated custody battle erupted in court. There was no evidence regarding the molestation of her son, but the woman convinced everyone present in court of this. During this time, the son lived with his mother. The custody case clearly dragged on and was ongoing at the time of the attack, so John Piaton looked like a very likely candidate for the role of an accomplice to the crime or the person who ordered it, hiring 2 hitmen. Even little Bert thought his father might be involved in this attack. The police contacted their colleagues in Virginia, where John lived, to verify whether the man had an alibi. It turned out he had a solid alibi at the time of the crime. He was working at the clinic. John himself denied being involved in the crime in any way, and there was no evidence against him. At that time, he was a successful plastic surgeon with an impeccable reputation. None of his acquaintances believed that John could molest his son or kill his ex-wife, whom he hadn't cared about for a long time. But John was not written off the list of suspects at that time and continued to be considered. Months passed, and the case made no progress. Tracy became worried. She felt even more unsafe as long as the second attacker was at large. She was afraid he would come back and take revenge on her. During this period, the police became interested in another suspect. Investigators turned their attention to Tracy's second husband, Michael. Upon closer inspection, it turned out that the marriage had long since fizzled out, and the old feelings between the lovers were gone. Could Michael have simply tried to get rid of his unwanted wife? Many people supported this theory, and not without reason. The woman's eldest son, Bert, told the terrible truth about his stepfather. The man was very strict, often severely punished the boy, devising sophisticated punishments for the slightest misconduct. Tracy herself, for some reason, ignored her husband's aggressive behavior and did not protect the children. Perhaps Tracy had been used to such treatment since childhood and saw nothing special in it. The investigators' suspicions were supported by Michael's actions at the hospital when he came to visit his surviving relatives. This alarmed them. It seemed that the man was genuinely surprised to see them safe and sound, apparently because this was not part of his plans. However, Michael had a rock-solid alibi. He was on a business trip in another city, which was confirmed by video surveillance recordings. The man was given a polygraph test, but he failed it and was clearly hiding something. Detectives believed there was a high probability of his involvement in organizing the attack. After a whole year of work, investigators had not come close to proving the criminal's guilt. But the victim's husband was behaving really strangely. For example, he never told his wife about the polygraph results and showed no sympathy for her. This caused a new wave of suspicion on her part, especially since the woman later found out about the failed polygraph test. Tracy became a real paranoid. She believed that both husbands were in cahoots and wanted to get rid of her to get sole custody of the children. She told the sheriff about her suspicions and backed them up with Michael's words, which he said in his sleep. The man was afraid their conspiracy would soon be exposed. Therefore, Tracy was convinced that both husbands were indeed conspiring against her. Detectives began to study Michael in detail and found out that, at the time of the crime, this man's business was on the verge of collapse, and he had small debts. But the couple had life insurance policies for $1 million, so the husband could have tried to get rid of Tracy for the money to solve all his problems. Besides, he was close to Dustin and could talk the young man into helping him with this. But these were just guesses. The investigators had no evidence of Michael's involvement. Meanwhile, the relationship between the Roberts couple was heating up. In 2004, 3 years after the attack, the Roberts' marriage fell apart. And it was the husband who filed for divorce. So far, law enforcement officers had no grounds to arrest the probable mastermind of the murder. By this time, Tracy and her children had moved to Omaha after the divorce. She changed not only her place of residence but also her job, and even her name. Hiding from everyone and fearing a new attack, her friend Mona, the mother of the murdered Justin, also moved to another city, taking her daughters with her. It turned out that this tragedy took not only Dustin's life, but also his father's. A year after the tragedy, on Thanksgiving Day 2002, the man took his own life right on his son's grave. The father was destroyed and grief-stricken over Dustin's death. Because of the sidelong glances from people who considered his son a dangerous criminal, Mona was completely devastated by the series of deaths, but vowed to clear her son's name of all this dirt. She continued to rack her brain over what really happened that day with her son and why he was in Tracy's house. The mother simply did not want to believe that he really wanted to harm the people who were his mentors. The young man simply valued his relationship with this family very much, as he had problems with social adaptation, and with them, he could feel calm. And he was very grateful to Michael. The woman even wanted to file a wrongful death lawsuit, trying to bring Tracy Roberts to justice for Dustin's death and find out what happened that night. Her lawyers began their own investigation and caught inconsistencies in the victim's story. As she retold it again and again, in one version, Tracy recognized Dustin immediately. In another case, she only learned the identity of the deceased later. According to her different testimonies, she shot from different positions. Because of these inconsistencies and confusion in details, the lawyers concluded that her story was a lie. On the day of the murder, Dustin's mother was out Christmas shopping. She called home to see if Dustin was awake because he had an important meeting scheduled that day. Her daughter answered and said that Michael had already left. Mona was happy, thinking it was a good sign that he woke up on his own and went about his important business. But later, her nephew called and reported that something had happened at the house of their friends, Michael and Tracy. Mona rushed over. She thought Tracy and Michael had killed each other, but she could never have guessed that her son had been killed. Mona also stated that the day before, Tracy herself had invited her son to her house to help her with something, and she suspected that the woman had lured the guy to her place this way, to kill him. The mother of the murdered guy was sure Tracy had something to hide. However, no one listened to Mona until 7 years after the break-in at the Roberts house, when the team of investigators in the hotel changed. The story was analyzed again, after which the officers also had suspicions that Tracy was not a hero who saved her children, but might be a lying murderer. There was not a single sign of forced entry or attempted robbery in the house. How then could two people have entered the house? 9 bullet wounds were counted on the wall. The guy was literally shot at point-blank range, leaving no chance of survival, and there were no traces of the second criminal at all. The new investigators decided to talk to Tracy's first husband. It turned out he was nothing like the monster she portrayed him as. The man reported that she herself had bouts of aggression, to the point that she once pointed a gun at him and threatened to kill him. As a result, she shot at the ceiling, after which the husband was forced to call the police. However, she told investigators that she was trying to take her own life, so she managed to avoid punishment. It was Tracy, not John, who was aggressive and unfaithful in the marriage, draining his bank cards. He even hired a private detective because of his suspicions, and he confirmed that numerous lovers were leaving the house while the husband was at work. As a result, it was the man who filed for divorce, as he began to fear his own wife and was tired of her antics. He was worried about his son, who was growing up in an unhealthy environment with a crazy mother, which is why he fought for custody of him, which infuriated Tracy. Despite her attempts to turn her son against his father, she had no evidence of abuse by her first husband. She understood that her ex-husband now had a better chance of getting custody than she did, and perhaps this is what motivated her to commit the crime to frame John. The dentist allegedly raped the woman during work. In fact, he had been harassed by her for a long time and was ready to prove it. There were cameras installed in his office, and video recordings confirmed his words. It turned out that Tracy, having learned about this, withdrew her lawsuit against the dentist the day before the crime, and the second husband, Michael, whom Tracy accused of beatings and harassment after the breakup, also refuted these words to detectives. He accused his wife of constant infidelity and a bad temper. He tolerated all this for the sake of the children, but eventually divorced her. Michael stated that he was a strict father but never hit his wife or children, and also claimed that Tracy turned the children against him. After the divorce, the man moved to California and focused on his business and was able to build it up. It seemed that the woman had slandered everyone around. She tried to portray herself as a victim of abuse from all the men in her circle, but in reality, it was the other way around. Investigators were convinced that the story of the events of December 13, 2001 was the exact same lie, fabricated by Tracy. They needed to meet the victim of the attack in person and talk to her. But at this time, the mother of 3 had not just moved to another state and changed her personal data. She regularly continued to change her contact information. While they were trying to find the woman, the police interviewed all of Tracy's close friends to understand her motives. The new suspect's friend gave important leads when officers pressured her. She helped Tracy clean the house after the attack, when she showed her the spot from where she started shooting at Dustin. What the woman described simply could not be true. Everything described was physically impossible to replicate. How could an ordinary, fragile woman so cleverly deal with 2 men? It just didn't add up. The police were forced to recheck the entire list of evidence. Among them was a very old computer found in the back seat of Dustin's car. Tracy believed this was the main proof of the robbery, as the equipment belonged to her husband. But it was unclear why Dustin stole it, when there were much more valuable and compact items in the house that were much easier to steal. For example, the money and jewelry that were lying in plain sight on the front seat of Dustin's car. A pink notebook was found in which the guy did not write a crime plan. Shortly before his death, it was written here that his tasks included killing Tracy Roberts, and the person who ordered the crime, strangely enough, was the first husband, John Piatan. But in these notes, the police found one oddity. There were too many details of what happened, which the young man simply could not have known before the attack. At the same time, it was his handwriting. It looked like Dustin wrote this under dictation, under some pretext or at gunpoint. Dustin's mother did not recognize this notebook. Besides, it was pink, more like a woman's. And Dustin didn't like this color and would never have bought such a notebook for himself. Besides, he never kept any diaries at all. There were no other entries in the notebook except for the crime plan, which also looked strange. It looked like it had just been bought and used only once to make the corresponding notes. It became more and more obvious that Tracy herself could have given this notebook to the guy to stage the crime. According to the new version of the investigation, the shot young man was not an attacker, but a victim of a deceitful criminal. He was easily influenced, trusting, and Tracy took advantage of this. By this time, the woman was found. Tracy was already having problems in her new place, namely with the authorities in the new town in Nebraska, where she had moved earlier. She was accused of forging documents, distorting information about her own identity. This became the reason for a search. The woman's apartment was inspected. Disturbing materials were found on the mother of three's computer. It was rather eccentric pornography, photos of dead people, and weapons. 10 years after the murder, the police managed to get to the truth. On July 27, 2011, they arrested the woman who was previously believed to have heroically defended her children. And the main impetus for the detectives were the memories of the friend who helped Tracy clean the house, and the victim's friend also knew about the notebook with Dustin's confession. And detectives were able to find out that all these stories were indeed written down earlier at Tracy's dictation. No signs of an attack were found in the house. The criminal was able to inflict the marks on her neck herself. This was confirmed by the fact that they were minor abrasions, not life-threatening. The nature of the bullet wounds on the victim's body also did not match the description of the woman killer. The episode describing Dustin trying to get up after being shot several times looked completely absurd. He had already died from such wounds. Experts who carefully studied the photos from the crime scene based on blood spatter concluded that Dustin did not get up. All the shots were fired from top to bottom while he was lying on the floor. This also did not fit into Tracy's story about the attack. She shot the guy when he posed no danger to her. However, the defense continued to insist that Tracy was saving her children. It was indeed a beautiful story, primarily aimed at convincing the jury of the defendant's lies. Besides, as the lawyers claimed, most of the evidence was circumstantial. The defense's trump card was supposed to be Bert, the defendant's eldest son. He said he heard men's voices behind the door and saw someone drag his mother away from the door. According to the teenager, the attacker said his mother was dead and he would be next, through the door. Later, he saw the young man with gunshot wounds trying to get up, just as the woman described. But the credibility of this testimony was questionable. According to the woman's first accounts, at that moment the children's room door was still closed, and the son simply could not have seen this. Therefore, the prosecutor believed that his mother had planted all this in his mind. The prosecutor insisted that the defendant murdered Dustin to frame her husbands and put them behind bars, gain sole custody of the children, and full access to their money. They saw this as the main motive for the crime. That same day, Tracy called Dustin at gunpoint and forced him to make entries in the notebook, and then shot him, and then staged an attack on herself. She inflicted minor injuries on herself, left the notebook and computer in his car. Even the medical examiner confirmed that she could not have lost consciousness from such injuries, which also sounded contradictory. After a lengthy discussion of the case materials, the jury found Tracy Roberts guilty of first-degree murder. The woman was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. After the verdict was announced, Tracy burst into tears in court. However, no one believed her tears, which were not there at all. Once again, the woman put on a drama. Bert, who was sure that his mother had saved all her children's lives that cold night and was illegally behind bars, took this event the hardest. He still visits and supports her. Tracy's second husband, after several years, with the permission of the guardianship authorities, took his children and, together with his new wife, moved back to his homeland in Australia. Tracy still maintains her innocence. She is serving her sentence at the Iowa Correctional Institution for Women, Mitchellville. If you liked this work, please support this video with likes. subscribe to the channel. Share your opinion in the comments. Do you think Tracy is really the victim in this story, wrongly convicted of murder, or did she stage the attack? And I also suggest watching these videos. Thanks everyone. And bye.